anyone believe that it's the third month of 2023? I mean, I feel like we're ripping through these fitness factors really quickly. Nutrition was really easy in the sense that it's not a hard sell for people. It is, my personal base background. My background was in clinical nutrition before I moved on in terms of the world of health. Sleep is one that I think we're all interested in right now, but I'll be honest, when I realized I was going to do respiration, I thought, how the hell am I going to fill an hour with breathing? I mean, we could do breathing exercises for an hour, but I can't see any of you. So I can't comment, nor can I see the ridiculous faces you may be making as I'm trying to instruct you. But this topic blew my mind. And I hope to take that mind blowage, if that's even a word, and transfer it to all of you, because very few people think about respiration unless you've done work with a breath coach, you've done some Wim Hof style breathing training. It's probably the thing that I think is most underutilized. I know I said something similar about sleep. I believe sleep is a different, you know, epidemic in terms of dysfunctional sleep. I think from a nutritional perspective, we as a society are catching wind that prioritizing your diet and taking, more precautions to avoid things that are compromising our health are well known. I hope to distill in everyone today, and I promise you, you're all going to be super mindful and almost self-conscious about your breathing as I go through different things, if you're not already. I want you to all have a different relationship with the concept of breathing after this for a multitude of reasons. I took it as a topic that extends and connects to other things. What I mean by that is it's not just about how to breathe, it's about how to connect dots when it comes to faulty breathing, we'll call it, and how your patients, clients, whomever you're trying to help may be demonstrating and exhibiting signs of dysfunctional breathing, but because, maybe you've never dived into it, you don't necessarily know, or you've never placed enough importance upon it, because let's be honest, it's kind of like knee-jerk advice, like take deep breaths. Sure, I'll do that. I don't feel so good. Why? I don't know. You should. That's the kind of thing that I think happens a lot of the case when someone, gives their and this and that kind of advice when it comes to here's your protocol plus these other lifestyle factors. So you might be thinking this, I know how to breathe, and Nicolas Cage can make absolutely anything look dramatic. But it is something that just happens, autonomously. Thank God we don't need to dedicate a lot of time or effort into this, or else life would feel very different if we needed to mindfully say, breathe in, breathe out every second of the day. But you'll come to realize that the way we breathe is probably far from optimal. I would say it's highly, highly dysfunctional, because think about this for a second. Who taught you how to breathe? I mean, mom and dad may have taught you how to ride a bike, someone taught you how to drive, how to do these life things that we just do, but we actually become dysfunctional in terms of our respiration as we get older. We're born with a beautiful ability to regulate respiration. The breath in, the breath out is innate to babies. You can even watch a baby's little diaphragm and belly go up and down in the lateral movement of their diaphragm as they take breaths. But we as a species have really lost our ability to breathe, and it's the contextual statement of what that means that I really want to dive into, because this fitness factor brought more to my awareness than the other two combined, because I started thinking about, what connects to breath. And, everyone is suffering from something if they're coming into our offices. And I do believe that this topic, although not necessarily as sexy as some others, might be more impactful as a synergy to assist you in guiding your clients back to the road to wellness, or the road to Wellsville, which is a hilarious movie. I highly suggest you all rewatch it if you haven't seen it for a few years. So here's the reality check. Most people do not breathe well. The normal adult respiratory rate, they say, is about 12 to 20 breaths a minute, which you might say, oh, that's, sounds not bad. But there is such a thing as a high adult respiratory rate, which is slightly above 20. They say above 20 is excessive. So that's short and shallow breathing. And when it comes to breathing, it's not just about the mechanisms or the mechanics of the breathing. It's how we breathe determines so much of how our body can regulate its autonomic processes, that if we can find a way to get down to what's called the optimal adult respiratory rate of about 6 to 10 breaths per minute, a Pandora's box of health opportunity opens up, because your default settings inside the body are going to find their way towards optimal. And we'll get into what this may feel like in a guided way in the future, because I want everyone to feel the difference, and then place your awareness on noticing how people in your company breathe on a regular basis, especially if they're in your office, and you'll come to find how many people are moving towards the high adult respiratory rate and they don't even realize it. Because here's the importance of breathing. We can live without we can live without food for weeks. We can live days without water. I don't want anyone to do a maximal breath hold competition on this call, and thankfully the microphones will be muted, but I can imagine some hearing kaboom in the background and someone collapsing. The average person can't live more than a minute to 2 minutes without causing some sort of permanent damage when there's oxygen starvation to the brain. Even the greatest trained deep sea divers who can hold their breath for 5 6 minutes, that's like spitting into the wind in terms of how long we can live without water, without food. So the breath of life really is that. It's the breath of life, and we have to understand that the more we move toward optimal, in some cases even 6 or under, we start to re-regulate coherence rhythms in the body that connect to our cardiovascular system, our autonomic nervous system, and our pulmonary system, our lungs, and gas exchange within our entire system. So when it comes to defining respiratory fitness, it's not about exercise. Some people might think it's analogous to VO2 max, which is volume of oxygen consumption maximal, which is a god-awful test. I don't know if anyone's ever done it here, where they're seeing at how high a rate of how high a rate of intensity can you exercise while your body is still consuming oxygen. So an elite athlete like a marathon runner, a Tour de France cyclist, anyone who's an ultra endurance athlete, a triathlete, their VO2 max is incredibly high, which means that they can sustain long durations, minutes to hours of high intensity activity while not going into what's called anaerobic metabolism, where the muscles start to build up lactate and they swell up with blood and they burn. Respiratory fitness is more so along the lines of the definition I brought up here. The ability to utilize the appropriate mechanisms of respiration, and nasal breathing is a little clue as to what the basis of it is, to provide optimal oxygen to tissues at rest and remove the carbon dioxide accumulation in the process. So what we're focusing on here is the start to end story about breathing mechanics and the ability to provide oxygen to tissues, the tissues to utilize oxygen, to remove the accumulated carbon dioxide at optimal rate, which is another clue about the future. And in doing so, we're maximizing these 3 categories that we're going to be focusing on today, because you're going to maximize energy production. One of our master philosophy concepts that we'll see in a minute is energy is everything. So everyone who is suffering from an illness has an energy problem. If we enhance energy production, we enhance vitality, we enhance longevity, we ward off the potential to develop dis-ease. And a big part of what that connects to is rhythms between the body, but more specifically the cardiorespiratory system. Breathing has its own cadence and rhythm, as does a blood pressure pulse within the body. There are even rhythms that extend from when the ventricle of the heart lets blood in and the ventricle closes and pumps blood out, that are connected to how our autonomic nervous system regulates itself. So we're going to dive into the autonomic nervous system and how proper breathing technique can help to entrain over a while, not by tomorrow or the day after, but with consistent effort, can help to entrain a healthier cardiorespiratory rhythm, and thus, again, maximizing energy production, leading to long-term health and wellness. And the last thing is about oxygen to carbon dioxide as a ratio, understanding why when someone tells you to breathe deeply and you start taking big breaths through your mouth, what you're actually doing is counterintuitive to what they're hoping and telling you to do in terms of the long term. So if those things don't catch people's interests, everyone loves something for free. This is by far the most well sought out free healthcare upgrade that you can do to learn to breathe better. Unless you want to pay for a fancy breathwork class and hallucinate doing some of the cool Wim Hof stuff and end up climbing a mountain in your underwear. That's cool too. Just we may want to start with something a little bit, less intense. So the clinical reality check is, how many of your clients or patients suffer from energy problems? How many of us provide breathing practices as strategies? everyone who is ill suffers from an energy problem, but we're very focused as clinicians on learning the mechanisms of action. What is the biochemistry saying? What is the functional lab aspect telling us? And we're trying to supplement and push biochemistry in a direction we want it to go. But what is it that ingrains that ability to hold what the supplements provide and move us towards a direction of wellness? Believe it or not, breathing and regulation of breathing patterns can be one of the most important things. It's all about value in terms of what I'm seeing that we're trying to provide with going through these fitness factors that Dr. Eric and Dr. Kelly spent a lot of time really, laying out and delving into in the book, The Thyroid Debacle, because you can only do so much with a really well thought out supplement plan. And I'm saying this as someone who is here talking on behalf of a supplement company. You can't escape the importance and the strategic value of utilizing supplements, but it's all the other things that work in this kind of holistic synergy that makes patient care, positive outcomes more comprehensive and more sustainable. So if anyone here is, looking at this for their own well-being, I challenge you, adopt some of these practices and make them consistent. You'll see the difference. But if you fall in love with them and develop a passion for something that is a little bit underutilized, but not underserved in terms of its importance, I guarantee your clients will start making great leaps and strides in terms of their own return to wellness and well-being. So we're going to talk about the three stories of human respiration today. Act one is energy production. I'm going to keep coming back to this because if we don't understand this stuff in terms of its practical, impotence or its practical ability to help people with understanding it, then we're going to be missing a lot. We really need to know how the body makes energy, why the body makes energy, and why focusing on anchoring the fundamentals of energy metabolism is going to be 101 in terms of any healthcare intervention. The second thing that I have been talking a lot about this in the past year in 2022 is understanding the autonomic nervous system. And I think the master class with Dr. Kevin Connors, he put it so succinctly. He said, to get someone to heal, you need to get them into parasympathetic. We'll dive into the details again to refresh, or if not, extend beyond what we've talked about already, some of the details of how the autonomic nervous system predisposes someone to being either stressed or recovered, but how it connects to breathing is so essential. And the last thing we'll touch on understanding how to breathe to not imbalance gas exchange within the body. And the encore is actually the practical stuff. What are we going to do starting tomorrow? What are we going to commit to? What are the tidbits of information that we can take for ourselves and also repurpose to our clients? And how can we coach them? How can we create a plan? Because the best intentions, unfulfilled oftentimes fall on deaf ears. So what we want to do is make these things actionable for yourself and for your clients, hopefully starting tomorrow. So we're going to start with act one, everything breathes. And I always want to bring back the understanding of relationships, holistic relationships specifically, that we are so intertwined with all life on this planet. And, the reason that we breathe is the same reason that plants breathe. We're providing sustenance and life force for each other. So light energy coming from the sun hits Earth in about, 12 to 13 minutes after a photon's released from the sun, which is incredible, speed of light. And plants have these specialized structures inside of them. They're called plastids. They're kind of like mitochondria. And during the process of photosynthesis, what these plastids do is they absorb photonic energy from the sun, and the sun's energy excites the water in the plastids to induce biochemical reactions to happen. And we all have to be very thankful to plants because they create very delicious things. They're called carbohydrates, and they create other delicious things. They're called fats. So we get food energy, calories from these plants, these photosynthetic reactions, but the byproduct of making these carbohydrates and fats is the off-gassing or the production of oxygen. So the plant gives us oxygen and sugars and fats will, be lumped as one, but most biochemistry textbooks negate fats for the ATP cycle. And what we're trying to do is get these sugars and fats and this oxygen into our mitochondria so we can make energy. And via the reverse reduction action, we're taking complex molecules and we're breaking them down to release their energy. We make water and carbon dioxide, which the plants will utilize the carbon dioxide to breathe in and start the process again. What a wonderful, wonderful mechanism that, kind of is an environmentally intertwined thing. So this is why, energy is everything in my books. When someone becomes ill, when the body becomes ill, it lacks sufficient energy to keep cells, tissues, and organs healthy. So technically, I'm not making everything super reductionist, but all biochemical dysfunction in my book is an energy problem. And lack of energy leads to degeneration. And if we do not recover sufficient energy to heal, then that degeneration is going to continue to progress to some sort of sustained pathology. So, in my opinion, when we're working with clients, what we're really trying to do is identify the mechanisms of action, or maybe the story is a better way of putting it, as to how they got ill, and how can we bring energy back to where energy is deficient. And an important thing to understand is when we're healing someone, we don't just need to bring in enough energy to help them regenerate. We need to bring in the energy to help them regenerate and sustain that health. Because if that energy production drops off, then that dis-ease has the potential to return. And how humans are designed to do this is aerobically. Aerobic means with oxygen, anaerobically means without oxygen. So you could say that the more powerful we are aerobically, the more powerful our metabolism is, because we're making energy very efficiently. An analogy I like to use is, when we are walking around in daily life, when we are doing whatever it is we do to get through our days, we want to be a fuel efficient vehicle. We want to be that something like a hybrid vehicle, which gets incredible gas mileage and goes long trips using a very small amount of fuel. That is aerobic metabolism in a nutshell. Anaerobic metabolism is highly inefficient. So that's more like being a race car or a Ferrari or a Corvette, something that gets absolutely terrible gas mileage, but you're going to have a lot of fun getting to wherever you're going to go. You're just not going to get very far. So we're focusing on how to use energy in optimal environmental conditions in the process of oxygen. So what we're doing when we're focusing on our intention to breathe deeply, which this lady on the left is doing, the biochemical story is happening on the right-hand side of the slide. When we diaphragmatically breathe, when we're breathing clean, high-quality air, we're breathing millions upon millions of oxygen molecules into our body. We're going into the lungs, and the blood that's going to go to the lungs is basically going to have empty hemoglobin, which is the main source of oxygen transport in the body. So our ability to breathe in clean air, our ability to bind oxygen to hemoglobin, and the ability to circulate that oxygen throughout the body to deliver those millions upon millions of oxygen molecules to very hungry cells is really the backbone of understanding why energy production is so important. But it's still not something that I find is super intuitive to people, or the further desire to learn more about energy metabolism is highly discouraging when you open a textbook and understand that there's a lot of mechanistic aspects that go into them that they don't make practical to be able to explain to people just why it's so important. So we're going to do that right now, at least to the best of my ability. And if all of you know this, bear with me. It's always good for a refresher. And hopefully this helps you understand that what we see in the textbook on the left-hand side is really being, visually represented on the right-hand side, because I'm pretty visual in terms of how I like to understand things. So we inhale fresh oxygen into our lungs. Hopefully you're using a HEPA filter if you're inside, or you're getting outside every day and getting some good quality air. When we inhale fresh oxygen into our lungs, that fresh oxygen is going to mix with the deoxygenated blood that has already given off oxygen and has absorbed carbon dioxide that is going to be released upon our exhalation. So when we reoxygenate the hemoglobin, the heart then pumps that oxygenated blood into circulation. And if you were here for the respiratory webinar last year, you'll understand that arteries go down to capillary beds, so they get progressively smaller and smaller. And the reason that we hopefully have a healthy cardiovascular system and we have healthy red blood cells is because to deliver oxygen to tissues, it's a pretty tight squeeze. Sometimes red blood cells have to fold to get into those capillary beds, but providing all of that's working well, we can deliver oxygen and other nutrients that are contained within the red blood cell directly into cells so that oxygen can diffuse into the cell and migrate its way to the mitochondria. The real reason we want oxygen to come into the body, that the sole purpose we breathe, is actually so the mitochondria can utilize oxygen in a biochemical process of making ATP. So providing that oxygen molecule has migrated to the mitochondria, and we've been eating sufficient calories in the form of high quality carbohydrates and fats, the body can make ATP and thus power up all the biochemical activities that require the energy for that cell to just sustain itself, perform optimally, and sustain health and vitality. In the process of making energy, as I said before, we make water and carbon dioxide. And those capillary beds also act as a two-way exchange. So the water is either there to hydrate our cells, or it becomes part of the extracellular matrix because our body is, highly, densely packed with water. And the carbon dioxide binds to those same hemoglobin molecules to go back to your lungs so that when you breathe out, you release carbon dioxide in an optimal ratio to the oxygen you took in, and everything works properly. I'm going to take a breath because that was a pretty long-winded explanation. But the understanding is, on the right-hand side, you see from lungs directly to the mitochondria in a muscle tissue. If someone is going to contract that muscle, let's say jogging, then this process gets sped up because the delivery to those working muscles is going to be prioritized, because the body's going to call for more energy to be made to sustain the activity of that exercise. And providing we can provide the oxygen, that we breathe well, that our tissues are healthy, and we have strong mitochondria, it's going to work really well, and we're going to make progress in our athletic endeavors. This happens every second of the day. Everyone's utilizing multiple, millions of molecules of oxygen right now. I mean, technically we have 32 trillion cells approximately. So you can imagine how much oxygen is being diffused and how much carbon dioxide is being released. But the important takeaway is that if we are not aerobic, we are anaerobic. So if we're not making energy in the presence of oxygen, we're making energy without oxygen. If anyone remembers biochemistry 101, one molecule of carbohydrate in the presence of oxygen will make us 36 ATP. If we do it anaerobically, one molecule of carbohydrate not in the presence of oxygen will make about 2 net ATP. So the amount of energy that is made aerobically far outweighs what we can ever think to do anaerobically. And the more we work in an anaerobic manner, the more we actually lose health and vitality, because we go into an energy deficit situation and the cell has to respond. The real reason, and this is the one thing I tell people, if you want to be the smartest person at a health-minded dinner party, ask everyone at the table the real reason we breathe. And it's not to maintain oxygen saturation in our blood. It's so that oxygen is the final electron acceptor in the mitochondrial respiratory chain, which allows those hydrogen ions to bind with oxygen, make water and carbon dioxide. And that little green thing on the right-hand side is the motor, if you will, in our cells, called ATP synthase. And it's these chemical reactions that power up our ability to make energy. The more efficient this process, the more energy we make. The more oxygen we're able to utilize, the more energy we make. The more mitochondria we have in our cells that are there to use that oxygen, the more energy we make. So this is why we can't escape the concept of energy is everything. So it comes back to some practical takeaways. If you have a client who's unwell, they have an energy problem, but we have to understand, how do we better contextualize that energy problem? Is it an active problem, meaning it's simply a reduced ability to intake oxygen and bind oxygen? That might be something in relation to poor respiratory exchange in their lungs. They may have scarring in their lung tissue. They may have the inability to carry oxygen because they lack the appropriate amount of hemoglobin. Or is it more of a reduced passive ability, the inability to use oxygen, which is where the concept of the cell danger response comes in. If you remember the core tenet of the cell danger response, our cells move from the perspectives of being power plants to more like battleships, because something is trying to insert its genetic material in the nucleus of the cell so it can survive. But anything that wants to survive also has to follow the laws of thermodynamics and biodynamics. It needs oxygen, it needs food. So if mitochondria are making an environment inhospitable by making more free radical superoxides, things of that nature, they're not utilizing oxygen to make an environment so inhospitable they're trying to push the viral infection out, then it's a reduced passive oxygen utilization capacity. Any of these scenarios are things that take energy and oxygen utilization away from someone. So it's important to understand that when we're focusing, hyper focusing on these things, we still have to understand that it is at its core an energy and an oxygen problem. And even though we may always be breathing and we may want to push, the ability to breathe more optimally, we have to know where the client is in their healing cycle before we instigate or encourage various breathing strategies that we may think are beneficial, when in reality the client's not quite there yet because they don't have the stress tolerance or the bandwidth to do some of these things. And that connects to the second part of this, which I call rhythms, because I said in the beginning, to put someone into healing, they have to get into parasympathetics. If I take the above scenario and talk about someone who's dealing with a viral, a fungal infection, heavy metal toxicity, things of that nature, all of those things are compromising energy production, and they're pushing someone into a sympathetically dominant state, whether they know it or not. So we have to understand the interplay between the relationship of not only parasympathetic and sympathetic, but how energy production is tied to an optimal autonomic nervous system regulation. And that's where we go next. So the master philosophy principle here, after energy is everything, is unless we can recruit parasympathetic, we cannot heal. So a body stuck in stress response will continue to fire nerves in sequence to make them better at sustaining stress response, because that's the input pattern that the physiology is receiving on a regular basis. But the reality is we want balance. A healthy body is all about balance. It's cliche, yes, yin yang. But if you look at certain mechanisms in the body, sympathetic, parasympathetic are yin and yang. If you go into a cellular mechanism, mTOR, which is growth, AMPK, which is breakdown, yin yang, there are these checks and balances that metabolism has to have intact in order for it to manifest in its healthiest state. So what we want to do is we want to figure out how can we entrain our clients to re-engage this balanced point of sympathetic parasympathetic activity in healthy reciprocity. And the reality is someone who is sick loses that balance. They're stuck in sympathetic dominance, and we associate sympathetic dominance with fight or flight. It's not a conscious thing. If someone has dysbiosis, if someone has nutritional deficiencies, if someone has a slight toxic accumulation of heavy metals, if someone is in a relationship that is causing them emotional stress, they may have that as their normal reality, and mentally they're coping okay with it, but it's their physiology in the background that is showing signs of stress. And this is where you'll see the practical manifestations of that. You'll see breathing rhythm be very specifically tied to a short, sharp, and shallow style of breathing rhythm. You will see the rhythm of how their heartbeats end up more like a metronome, have no variability in it. It will be like the tick-tock of the pendulum on a grandfather clock. That rhyme, which is kind of cool. And then you'll have actual oscillations in their blood pressure rhythms. There's about 6 oscillations per minute in terms of the rhythmic impact of how the blood pressure changes based upon how blood goes in and out of the heart. And I don't think it's an accident when we realize that 6 breaths a minute, which is 6 oscillations per minute, is actually the optimal rhythm or cadence of breathing. Because there's some cool research that I figured out that when you align the oscillation rhythms of the heart with the oscillation rhythms of the breath, you sync head and heart coherence, and you can actually work to improve the strength and power of the autonomic nervous system, the recruitment of the parasympathetics via the vagus nerve, and ultimately long-term health and well-being. Because sympathetic activity, I do believe, gets a bad rap. I said there is an oscillation between the two. So sympathetic happens every time you breathe in, and for good measure. Inhalation is always accompanied with an increase in heart rate. Why? Because we have all of this oxygenated blood that we want to get out to tissues. So if I increase my heart rate and the force of contraction, I'm going to send blood there more strategically and more powerfully, so that oxygen can diffuse, and it ties back to the first principle of energy production. Exhalation is parasympathetic. So the heart now decreases its rate, and we want to make sure that we're breathing slower so our exhalation doesn't blow off too much carbon dioxide, because the ratio between those two is paramount for optimal energy production. The vagus nerve is the thing that actually regulates the breathing. So think of the vagus nerve as like a brake on the heart. When the vagus nerve is active, the brakes are pressed. This is a good thing. You don't want to be driving around all day without the ability to press the brake. The reason the brake gets pressed is because it actually slows the heart down to a process that in your lifetime might save 350 million heartbeats. And one of the first insights I had when it came to being a health professional is the concept that the heart is probably engineered with a certain number of beats in it. And the reason exercise is so beneficial is it actually slows down your resting heart rate, increases what's called your stroke volume, and increases the ability of the blood to carry oxygen more efficiently. So that's why I believe exercise in an appropriate manner is a life extending activity that we can engage in. But the additional thing is, when we regulate the autonomic nervous system, we can recruit digestion more optimally, we can recruit detoxification pathways, we can regulate all the processes that help us maintain our health and well-being besides just regulating the autonomic nervous system. So these concepts are really important to understand, because what the autonomic nervous system has a large influence over are all of these things right here. So blood oxygen saturation, based upon not only how much we can bind, but the ability to intake oxygen, blood oxygen carbon dioxide levels, which are not prioritized enough, because for the body to give off oxygen, it can't overly expel carbon dioxide. Resting heart rate, typically speaking, unless someone's hyperkalemic or they have some kind of cardiovascular issue, a lower resting heart rate like that of an athlete is always going to be a healthier marker than someone who has an elevated resting heart rate, because that person is stuck in sympathetic dominance. Blood pressure is the same thing. Typically accompanied with a lower resting heart rate, we have lower blood pressure. And why blood pressure is an important consideration is when liquid is forced to flow through a tube with a lot of resistance, it induces shear stress. So the arteries are very delicate tissues. You know, they're like the digestive layer. They're a single cell layer thick, and they're made of fragile cells. We don't want to be stressing them out by forcing blood to flow into those tissues too quickly when we have vasoconstriction from a sympathetic nervous system response. And the last part is vagal tone and parasympathetic activation. Typically speaking, in neurology, there's a cliche saying, neurons that fire together wire together. So people who have had a down regulation of the ability to recruit vagal tone don't have the ability to hit these 5 important markers, you know, considering blood oxygen saturation, resting heart rate, ideal blood pressure. So the more we can entrain ourselves through breathing to tap into that vagus nerve and that autonomic nervous system, the more we kind of recruit this whole symphony of interconnectedness. Because there are nerve cells within the lungs, and this is how the cardiovascular system communicates and interplays within the lungs. Deep breathing activates these things called pulmonary stretch receptors in the lungs. So the lungs are always taking stock of how much air is coming in, and the rhythm or the speed at which these things are sending information back to the brain and the nervous system monitors things like lung volume and interabdominal pressure. So in a healthy person, I do believe regulated nasal breathing is the path to enhance vagal tone, which has a very strong influence over the autonomic nervous system and associated function. So we can push people into this direction with doing these kinds of things, but forced deep breathing without understanding the mechanics of improper breathing can be actually something that pushes people into a more specific stress response, which I'll ask anyone without wanting an answer. If you ever wondered why people breathe into a paper bag when they're having a panic attack, the answer to that is why you don't want to force someone to breathe improperly before they're ready for it. So I'm going to give everyone a little bit of an opportunity to try something here. We're not going to do it for too long because I want to respect the amount of time we have for this webinar, but I want you to bring awareness to how your body feels as I guide you through a few different styles of breath practice. This is the first pattern. So if someone's breathing on the high end of normal, they're doing about 20 breaths a minute, which is about 3 seconds per inhalation, if my math checks out quickly. So what I want everyone to do here is I want you to bring your awareness to your throat and a little bit of your chest as you breathe. And I'm going to count 1, 2, in, out. 1, 2, in, out. Breathe with me. 1, 2, in, out. 3 more. 1, 2, in, out. 1, 2, in, out. 1, 2, in, rest. And if I could see you guys and talk to you guys, I would get some feedback. But I'm going to assume that felt really uncomfortable. It felt really foreign. And breathing into your throat and breathing into your chest did not induce a feeling of relaxation. But I want you to think about this. If you've ever sat next to an elderly person who's not in well health, and you've listened to them breathe, and I've done this before, this is kind of the pattern they breathe in. It's very short, sharp breathing. There is no diaphragmatic influence. There is no slow exhalation. It's just a short, sharp breath to get oxygen, whatever little oxygen that can come in, and just to regulate that rhythm. This is a very obvious sign of what's called a sympathetic dominant pattern. And people don't necessarily know they're in this because if their normal experience of their physiology is feeling unwell, then this is just what's called normal. The second pattern is on the low end of normal breathing. So I'll guide the repetition with a 2-second inhalation, a 1-second pause, and a 2-second exhalation. So we'll start in 3, 2, 1, 1, 2, pause, 1, 2, out, 1, 2, pause, 1, 2, out, 1, 2, pause, 1, 2, out. 2 more. 1, 2, pause. 1, 2, out. 1, 2, pause. 1, 2, finish. Again, not a wonderful breathing pattern because it's on the low end of normal, but normal and optimal are two very different words. I find when I tried this one, I was able to breathe into my chest, but it was very hard to get a satisfying breath directly into the diaphragm. And if you understand why the diaphragm is so important, the vagus nerve not only innervates all the way down from, your second and third cervical vertebrae, but it also has what's called a sacral outflow, which breathing into your diaphragm theoretically brings energy and movement into the area that activate the lower half of your vagus nerves. So the last pattern is optimal, if you will. We're going to do 6 breaths a minute. We'll do only about 3 or 4 of them here because the cadence is a little slower. So it's going to be a slow 4-second inhalation, a 1-second pause, a slow 4-second exhalation with another pause. And what can help everyone is if you place your fingers either on your diaphragm, just to the sides of your belly button, or a little bit towards the back of the lateral sides of your torso. I want you to bring your intention there as we guide our breaths in and out. So we'll do 4 together. So ready, we're going to go in, 1, 2, 3, 4, pause, 1, 2, 3, 4, pause. 1, 2, 3, 4, pause. 1, 2, 3, 4, pause. 2 more. 1, 2, 3, 4, pause. Collapse the diaphragm. 1, 2, 3, 4, pause. Last one. 1, 2, 3, 4, pause. 1, 2, 3, 4, finish. I swear I could feel all of you breathing in a way more relaxed way. So that last pattern is getting you into a cadence that if you do regularly, you're moving towards optimal. But I doubt that most people have conditioned themselves to breathe that way on a regular basis. But this is the one that kind of gets you into that alignment of rhythms within the cardiovascular system matching rhythms within the respiratory system. I think that's pretty cool. And these are questions that I want you to kind of be mindful of for yourselves, but also so you can help coach people much more accurately on what it is you want them to do. Ask them what felt most natural, and the answer will probably tell you where they're either able to stay on that breathing spectrum or where they are currently based upon how their body's regulating itself. If the slow breaths felt uncomfortable, they may have very deconditioned diaphragmatic muscles. Or if their intuition was to breathe into the chest and breathe into the throat, well, you know that they're not doing proper diaphragmatic breathing. And that has to be kind of educated out of people so they can start taking on a more optimal way of doing it. And it's kind of a cliche question. How do you think most people breathe? Well, besides the obvious, away from optimal, it's not mindful. There's very little mindful practice in the practice of breathing, which is why to do something better autonomically, you have to do it consciously in the beginning. So, learning to relate with our breath gives us the ability to expand our stress tolerances, and appropriate specific nervous system responses that correlate with health. But these things are, yes, free. Yes, they are wonderful in terms of their return on investment. I think the hardest part is convincing people to do them, which is why it's important not to be idealistic or dogmatic about this stuff with your clients. Figure out what they're willing to do, and you may have to become a little bit strategic and negotiate with them how they're going to introduce some of these things. Because I'll be honest with you, the last 2 weeks I have been so mindful about how I've been breathing, simply watching TV or watching something on my computer rather, or doing work. And then I catch myself holding my breath when I'm typing something really intensely, or when I'm reading something very focusedly. My body doesn't want to breathe regularly when I'm hyper focused, which tells me I'm engaging a stress response and a lot of corticosteroid and releasing factors to get that work done. And that is a surefire way to deplete resources. So the autonomic function is pushing the body to, into a more sustained state. If we can't recruit parasympathetic, it means we're kind of stuck in a sympathetic state. And if we want rest, recovery, and to digest properly, parasympathetic is the way we want to go. So pathological sympathetic dominance in terms of a driving style, as an analogy, is if you drive with your foot to the floor all the time or not, it means you're either flooring the gas or you're jumping on the brakes as hard as you can. What is that going to do to the wellness or the operational abilities of your car? It's going to deplete gas much faster. It's going to wear out components like your brakes. It's going to make your tires be worn out quicker. It's going to decondition all the componentry in your vehicle. The same thing happens to the body. Depletion of bodily resources compromises metabolism, pushes us from aerobic to anaerobic, which means we're not going to make energy in a sustained way. So if someone is already ill, this is going to develop a worsening of their symptoms. But if someone is not ill yet, this is the pathway to developing issues that someone can ceremoniously name a pathology given enough time if it's sustained. So now we need to dive into the last aspect to understand why jumping into breathing techniques too vivaciously might not be an optimal idea. Because again, this concept of balance comes back because we're after oxygen, but if we don't consider carbon dioxide, we can't maximize our return of investment on oxygen, because these two are complementary opposites that do need to be in balance. Pushing one to the excess in either direction upsets both, and sometimes that's a good thing. If you're doing intensive exercise and you're, breathing through your mouth and you're trying to offset the ability to fatigue anaerobic metabolism like hill sprints or whatever, there are some wonderful return on investments. But if someone is a mouth breather and they are hyperventilating on a regular basis and they start to excessively blow off carbon dioxide, well, what happens is the body will sense that there's a carbon dioxide deficit in the blood. And as a result, the body will hold on to those oxygen molecules that are circulating in our hemoglobin. So oxygen, even though it's in the body, isn't being delivered to tissues, and we become hypoxic. And the previous two categories, energy metabolism becomes compromised, sympathetic nervous system activation ensues. We're actually sustaining this feedback pattern in a very positive way. How this happens is really down to how we breathe. So when we overbreathe, when someone is breathing too frequently, which is something we talked about, or if they're breathing improperly, they're likely burning off too much carbon dioxide. So their body has to force them to take another breath in because it's not going to release oxygen. So they need to in order just to keep up with the demands. And the result is the oxygen that's destined to be delivered to the cells no longer arrives. The cell becomes hypoxic, and when there's no oxygen, anaerobic metabolism is our fallback plan. It's our fail-safe. So the activation of a sympathetic nervous system response is going to be accompanied with an increase of blood pressure and an increased heart rate. And this is one of the very many mechanisms that can trigger the chronic cell danger response. And the thing about humans is we're habitual creatures, and we also take the path of least resistance. So when this becomes normal, we call it a habit. And the only way to change that habit is by starting new behaviors, which take a little bit of time to become ingrained in our realities to become our new normal. Because yes, breathing is innate and it's only healthy when it's done properly. At this age, almost all of us breathe properly, and we are metabolic powerhouses. Have you never noticed how much energy children have, even when they don't eat? It actually defies biochemical understanding. And a big part of that is they use their energy so efficiently. As we age, it changes. So as we age, we need to upgrade our gas exchange. Man, I'm full of rhymes today. I'm freestyling and no one's even realizing it. Maybe you are. So what we want to do is figure out how can we make this process sustainable, but how can we introduce it in a way where it's not either too cumbersome and too intimidating for us? And I believe these 5 aspects of consideration are very important. And it really starts with you yourself and personal mindfulness. Since I personally started engaging in mindfulness practices and meditation and the like many years ago, I realized that the 2 most powerful things we possess inside our realities are awareness and mindfulness. Sometimes they're used as interchangeable synonyms. I actually don't think they're synonyms. I think they're complementary descriptive terms. So when you're changing your breathing, you have to have the awareness that you want to do it. And then when you're trying to breathe in a more mindful way, which is the strategic application of how you're breathing, that's how you make it a regular practice. So the example of doing a breathing exercise is you want to do this in an environment that's well suited to you. You have to make the commitment and you have to do this on a regular basis in order to do so. But that environment is the piece where you have to be a good clinician to understand where your client is in their readiness to adopt a new practice. They may need a totally quiet environment, something like when no one's in the house, they can practice their breathing exercises. Other people might need something like meditation music or using something like a brain tap headset, which Dr. Patrick Porter is going to be our next masterclass guest at the end of the month. And there are a lot of different tools and technologies out there that can help deal with the monkey mind while you're practicing, which is kind of a very boring but mindful practice of breathing. The mindfulness is the methodology of how you're going to breathe. So is it going to be box breathing? Is it going to be, a tempoed breathing that has been given to you by a breathwork coach? This is really where it's up to you. There is no right or wrong way to do this. There are a multitude of options, but if someone doesn't have the internal desire to adopt this and then construct it in a way that is sustainable, unfortunately, these practices often fall by the wayside. So when it comes to breathing technique, the little I can share with you based upon appropriate or correct ways are as follows. If you are a mouth breather and you can convince yourself to breathe through your nose, that's really the basis of all of it. If you can entrain yourself to inhale and exhale through the nose, the following things happen. The nose filters the air, which means that if you're not filtering your environment, hopefully your nose hairs and boogers are trapping things that are not going to get into your lungs. It also warms the air because just like water, there's an optimal temperature for oxygen density or water to be absorbed by the body. Nasal breathing does not bias the sympathetic nervous system response like mouth breathing does. And nasal breathing does not regulate oxygen coming in with the ability to over exhale carbon dioxide leaving like mouth breathing does. So the benefits of nasal breathing are balanced by the detriments that are complementary opposites of mouth breathing, if that makes sense. So nasal breathing 101 technique, that's where you want to start. The second thing is looking at air quality. The air in the home is likely worse than anything you're breathing outside. So all of these things, which I'm sure all of you either speak with your clients about already, or need to be reminded of, using a good HEPA filter. If you do have carpets, vacuuming frequently, please throw out those awful artificial air fresheners. Those things are toxic. You're breathing those things in on a regular basis, and making sure the same deal with cleaning products. And if you are going to smoke a good cigar or something else, depending on the state you're in, do it outside. And I cannot tell you the underrated benefits of using something like a neti pot on a regular basis, or a humidifier or essential oils to help improve not only the cleanliness of your sinuses, but to clear out the potential blockages that force someone to breathe in the mouth anyways. In the interest of time, I'm not going to have you all do this as a group, but I'm going to quickly explain it. There is a way to determine how well you breathe. So, what you want to do, and do this on your own time, is you can take a very short breath out through your nose, fully exhale, then take a normal breath in. Don't over inhale. And the minute you stop the breath, pinch your nose and start timing. This is essentially a breath hold test to see how efficiently and effectively your body is able to use oxygen. So, what you want to do is you want to aim for a 40-second or greater optimized breath hold time, which was an incredibly humbling experience for me, especially having been, a competitive athlete my entire life, to realize that I couldn't get to like 25, 30 seconds the first time I did this without feeling like I needed to breathe. And the goal is not to hold your breath as long as you can and be a hero. It's the minute you start to feel any sort of discomfort, you breathe again. And what's great about this is it's a way to initially test and then retest and verify that your breathing practices and all the other aspects that you're synergistically doing with your body are translating to a better ability of your body to carry and utilize oxygen. So a big part of that does start with additional strategies to go along with your nasal breathing. Some important Taoist, breathing methods are actually gentle breathing, and the saying is you should breathe so gently that the hairs in your nose don't even know air is going past them. And that's just part of the technical know-how. But there are some other strategies that I'll share with you guys here. I'll leave them to your own exploration. But something that's a really good strategy to see if you are breathing through your nose through the night is doing mouth taping. Because taping your mouth at night and waking up with that tape on your mouth lets you know that you can sleep effectively through the night without needing to take that tape off at 2 a.m. because your body's starving for oxygen. And if you want to challenge yourself or stress yourself in an activity based fashion, try to increase the level of light cardiovascular intensity that you can sustain while still breathing through your nose. I've been doing this on a bike lately just to see at what speed can I cycle without needing to start breathing through my mouth or feeling like I'm getting a little bit starved for oxygen. There are so many different styles of breathing that this could be an hour talk in and of itself. I left some of the common things there, but I think reading the book The Oxygen Advantage is probably a great starting point because some of these other things may not be synergistic with your style of practice. But getting the basis of the science behind the essential nature of proper breathing, that's the best place to start when it comes to that. And then when it comes to creating a plan, well, we have to understand that sleep, nutrition, supplementation, exercise, these are all things we think about on a regular basis, but we don't give our clients a breathing strategy or intervene to make sure that we can synergize their ability to breathe with all of the other wonderful things we're giving to them. So I've created a way to scientifically construct this where you can do that breath hold test with a client and record that. And you can also do this in conjunction with taking a baseline heart rate variability assessment with a chest strap. So you get a pattern of their ability to carry oxygen and a pattern of what their autonomic nervous system looks like. And then based upon the interventions you select, it could be teaching them to diaphragmatically breathe. If they're mouth breathers, you're going to teach them to nasally breathe. And then maybe you're going to progress it from a normal tempo down to a slow breathing tempo so they can get used to diaphragmatic breathing in a rhythm that is more optimal for their body's ability to entrain this process as normal. And then you can encourage them to do more what's called zone 2 cardio, where you're doing a certain level of intensity for a prolonged state to improve the body's energy production and oxygen carrying capacities, stimulate mitochondrial density, and all that good stuff that comes from essentially using the breath to retrain and enhance our metabolisms. So we have a few minutes. We have a few products that I want to go through. I want to respect time, but I can stay a little bit longer after the lecture is done if anyone has questions. So we'll go through our few products. Now, I want to very quickly touch on supplementation. When it comes to breathing, you might be thinking, well, how are we going to connect these things? And you're right, there is no supplement that's going to help you be a better breather or help you to respire more optimally. What we're going to try to do here is look at what aspects of physiology might be something that is holding you back from a very literal functional perspective, but also from a systemic perspective. So if someone does have lung issues, if there is a respiratory infection, there is a symptom that will be, unnamed that is causing someone to have long-term issues with their ability to utilize oxygen, then we got something for that. Seazyme, believe it or not, is an over-the-counter therapeutic in Japan for things like COPD and pulmonary obstructions, things of that nature. Functionally, the only thing that would downregulate someone's ability to bind oxygen is the ability for gas exchange in the lungs to be suboptimal, meaning something in the alveolar structure, something is compromising the ability for the lungs to intake oxygen in a functional way. And if someone has long-term chronic respiratory infections, you want to do something to deal with that. So Czyme is the go-to because what it does is if there is excessive mucus production, anytime there's mucosal production, you have infection. And sometimes those mucolytic proteins are driving an inflammatory response that prevents the body from clearing the infection. So the enzymatic assistance of Czyme has the ability to work in conjunction with those mucolytic proteins and immune cells to help clear the infection so the airways can be clear and functional again. Because if someone's got chronic lung infections, no matter what they do in terms of nasal breathing, they're not going to get the necessary amount of oxygen flow that is going to properly saturate the blood with enough oxygen to make energy. And then there is, talking about what may be peripherally connected. And most people don't remember that the lung has its own microbiome. Anywhere there's a mucosa, you will find little critters living and calling that place home. So if someone has chronic lung issues, and it's not as a result of an infection or any issue that can be sourced, something like asthma, for example, if someone has chronic leaky gut, chronic inflammatory dysbiosis that is migrating into the bloodstream or the lymphatic system and getting directly into the lungs, well, things can be carried within that. And in the thyroid debacle, there was a statement that basically said, chronically poor breathing can be induced via chronic systemic inflammation and cell stress. There is not one path to cell stress. There is a multitude of different avenues there. And I do believe that a lot of, especially young kids who have chronic asthma, a big part of it is the interplay between what's going on in the gut microbiome, the immune system, and it's the collateral damage or the side effect of what they're experiencing if we rule out, breathing in asbestos and any kind of environmental influences, that working on your colon specifically with something like Trubifido, which also has its, blend of microbes that promote the production of anti-inflammatory cytokines, sometimes you need to downregulate the stresses that the body's being placed under if you are to remediate an infection systemically. And probiotics do go, hand in hand with fibers because the bugs need some sort of food. So something like True Fiber, which has a combination of the sun fiber, which is a very well researched product that we've talked about at length, with the addition of bifidogenic enzymes that work on a couple different levels. Number one, first and foremost, if there are infections or infestations in the system, candida, dysbiosis, what have you, sometimes those biofilms can benefit from the ability to break down when they're interacting with specific kinds of enzymes. But we know that bifido is a very easy strain to wipe out, and bifido's home really is in the colon. So if you're wanting to repopulate someone's lower digestive system utilizing probiotics in conjunction with prebiotics, True Bifido and True Fiber can be a very therapeutic combination. You would just obviously want to, pre-qualify that person for arriving at the ultimate decision to use these two products in tandem and see how they tolerate it. And next month, I believe we're doing emotional fitness. And me personally, what I'm interested in right now is diving into traditional Chinese medicine and understanding the 12 organ meridians. The lung and the colon are connected, which is kind of poetically perfect for today's talk. And if you think about it, you can't separate the emotional or the psychological emotional connection that someone may have in their lives that may connect to their illness. And in Chinese medicine, the lungs are the seat of grief, and the colon is what processes that waste out of the body. And I don't necessarily just mean fecal matter waste, I mean energetic emotional waste. So if people are dealing with, chronic bowel obstruction, or not obstruction, but, bowel motility issues and constipation, maybe something beyond just the physical needs to be examined. And we're going to get into that next month, but I thought that was kind of a nice tie-in. And with that, everyone, I believe I did it on time. I need to start breathing a little bit more. And I hope this was interesting to you as always. I hope you all got a lot more oxygen than you normally do because it brought awareness to your breath. And I'm really excited about, what we're doing for the rest of the month in terms of the fitness factors. March 15th, we have the Ask Me Anything with Dr. Eric Belkovich, which is going to be live 2 days before St. Patty's Day. So everyone's going to be totally focused. It would have been a really bad day to do it on the 17th. At the end of the month, Dr. Patrick Porter, who is an absolute wizard in neuroscience and the founder of BrainTap, is going to be part of our masterclass, and I'm going to interview him talking about the autonomic nervous system and digestion and a lot of the things we spoke about here. So please put those in your calendars. Thank you all for your attendance. Thank you for being part of this whole thing. I hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you soon. And now I can take some questions if anyone's interested. We'll leave a little bit of time. If that's okay with you, Jeff, there's a couple that popped in here.
Perfect. Yes, thank you. I was just going to put that in the chat room. So it looks like you can
Hey.
handle those. And if any other ones pop in the meantime, I will also put the chat on if anyone at this point now, so you can talk through the chat as well.
So Andrea asked, does this work, or are there any specific exercises for a person who has congestive heart failure? Well, I can't give any specific answer from experience, nor can I say there's a definite yes or no. But generally speaking, Andrea, anytime you can improve the body's ability to recruit vagal tone through slow, steady, rhythmic nasal breathing, it's likely going to help. The only way that deep breathing can hurt someone with congestive heart failure is if you stress the heart out too much by either taking massive inhalations through the mouth and then thus blowing off way too much carbon dioxide, doing mouth exhalations, and then stressing them and increasing their heart rate. So I would imagine, just based upon logic telling me here, if you can slow down breathing cadence and that will translate into lowering the resting heart rate, I do believe it can only be beneficial for that person. I mean, congestive heart failure is a big thing. COPD is a little bit different. You would have to see how they tolerated the ability to breathe deeply, just, knowing if there were impedances based upon the condition of their lung tissue and their ability to actually utilize and bind oxygen. Because, sometimes those people are on respirators, and if they are, I don't see how teaching someone to really slow down the process of breathing, providing they felt good doing it, is something that I would highly encourage. I hope that answers that question. The second one, what is the CHBT, is controlled hold breath test. So that's the test where you're taking a small exhalation and a normal inhalation, plugging your nose and holding your breath to a timer to see when your body's first initiation of wanting to breathe is. So doing the CHBT test, controlled hold breath test, is a way to determine how effectively your body is able to sustain itself off of one single breath, and it gives you an idea where you are on your proper breathing abilities, is probably a good way to put it, or your ability to powerfully utilize oxygen and have your respiration reflect healthy metabolism.